session today on mental health and disclosure, your rights to privacy and adjustments. And I'm Tab Ahmed, the founder and CEO of EmployAbility. Also with me today, I've got Cindy McAllister and Mariella, who will be monitoring the chat. So if you can just let yourselves be known, Cindy and Mariella, so everybody can see who you are, that would be great.
Hi there.
Hi.
Thank you. So if you have any questions during the session, do feel free to put those in the chat and Cindy will ask me those at the appropriate time. There is an opportunity at the end to ask questions, of course, but equally, if you want to ask them as we're going along, that's fine too. And Cindy will just ask me those at the right time during the session. So do feel free to ask questions. We want you to engage with this session. I'm sure you've got lots of questions, so do feel free to put those there and we'll try and answer those. I wanted to kick off really by just talking about EmployAbility and who we are, for those of you that don't know us, and what we do. So our mission is to create a truly neurodiverse and disability inclusive workplace. We're unapologetic in our drive for a level playing field, and we support students with disability and neurodivergence to ensure equity in the recruitment process and in the workplace and in the transition from education to employment. We also work with lots of large global corporate organisations and some smaller ones too, to ensure that there is a disability, good practice and equity as well, and to make sure that they can be inclusive employers of choice. We're really pleased to have University of Manchester as one of our next generation inclusive university partners. And for us, that enables us to work closely with your careers service and to ensure that you can be supported to get the careers that you deserve. Through us, you can apply for internships, graduate programs, first year programs, scholarships, come to events and so on. But of course, also you can attend any of our student empowerment sessions like this and others that will be running throughout the year, as well as our skills enhancement maximisation sessions as well, on things like how to write a good CV, how to do well at interviews and assessment days, and so on. We also have lots of specialist webinars and resources, so do tap into those. And of course, you can become an EmployAbility Campus Ambassador with us. And that means that you have a chance to then really promote the work we do to your university, and it's a great thing for you to put on your CV. And if that's something that you're interested in, then please do reach out to Mariella or to Cindy, who will put their contact details in the chat. One of the really important pieces of work that we do because of our relationship with Manchester is to ensure that we can provide adjustments advice to you, work with you really closely on that, but also to work with you to ensure that we can advocate that on your behalf if you're not comfortable to do so with an employer. That means our student support team will have a detailed discussion with you about what adjustments you might need for a specific recruitment process, and these might be different from those that you've had at university, and they can then, on your behalf, advocate that to the employer. That means you can turn up on the day in full knowledge that your adjustments will be made for you, and you can focus on ensuring that you can showcase your skills and talents. Today's session is all about mental health and mental ill health as a disability. I just wanted to talk a little bit about what that means and what that looks like. So it covers a wide range of conditions. I know that sometimes when we think of the term disability, we might not necessarily self-identify with having a disability. People still think of disability as something physical, something visible. And often people with mental health don't necessarily self-identify. And I can talk from personal experience to this. I've had panic and anxiety attacks for most of my life. And even though I work in this space, it was only a few years ago that it occurred to me that what I have is actually a disability. It had never occurred to me before. So I know for a lot of you there, you might not think of your mental health as a disability, but it doesn't mean that it's not in terms of for legal purposes. So under the law, the definition of disability is very, very wide ranging. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about what that is so that you understand fully what protections it can afford you under the Equality Act. So it's a wide range of conditions, obviously like schizophrenia, panic anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorders, depression, things like that. So wide range, and you'll know what that is if you're being impacted by that. 17% of students at university have a mental health condition, and we suspect that that figure is very understated because that will just be from people who have reported that they have a mental health condition. Focus is very much upon the impact it has on you as opposed to the diagnosis. And I'm talking here particularly about recruitment as opposed to adjustments you might be getting at university. It's much more to do with sort of how it affects your everyday life. And in terms of the law, whether or not it's classified as a disability and therefore whether it affords you protection under the Equality Act, is whether or not your condition has lasted for or is likely to last for 12 months or more. So for example, if you have a bereavement of somebody that you're close to, family member or close friend, and understandably you're down, depressed, or anxious for 3 months, 6 months, but then you make a full recovery, that would not be deemed to be a disability under the Equality Act. However, if you have cyclical depression, if you get panic and anxiety attacks, not present 24/7, but they keep coming time after time, year over year, then those things would be deemed to be a disability and you would have protections under the law. I think the important thing here is, rather than focusing on the legal definition, rather than focusing on whether or not what you have is or isn't technically a disability, I think the key part here is that if you feel that you're impacted by your mental health and you need adjustments in the recruitment process, then ask for those, and you are able to get those even without a diagnosis. So don't worry too much about the legal definition at this point. So why is mental health so hard to talk about? Well, I think first of all, the first thing I'd say is I've got a list here of different things, but there is definite overlap in these. For a lot of people, they feel a lot of stigma attached to mental health about privacy. It's about how you might feel about disclosing that information to other people and then worrying about what they might then feel about it. Your fears around that, your fears about telling somebody what you think might be a weakness in you, for example, or your fears about being perceived differently. And then there's others' perceptions, or misperceptions, if you like, how others see our mental health. They might sort of see it as a small difficulty that we can easily cope with. You might hear things like pull yourself together, or well, just get over it, or things aren't as bad for you as they are for other people, or you're not trying hard enough, those sorts of things. Either as things that people may actually say to you or things that you might think they're feeling about you. And that in and of itself can lead to fear and not quite knowing how to respond to that. And often these sorts of comments come from lack of knowledge on the person, for the person who's making any comments like this, not necessarily because they don't want to be supportive, but maybe they don't know how to be supportive. And then there's imposter syndrome, this feeling that somehow, because of our mental health, that somehow we're not good enough, somehow we haven't quite got what it takes. And then the other part of imposter syndrome is, well, it's not really a disability, is it? Things are kind of really okay in my life, so maybe I shouldn't really be feeling like this. And I guess what I'd say to you is, it's not about any of these things. I think if you feel a particular way, then you feel that way. And if that feeling is stopping you from being able to do certain things, and it's really important that you get support around that. It's really important from the perspective of looking for employment that you get the right adjustments to ensure that that's not going to impact you during a recruitment process, and that the right adjustments can be put in place so that you can showcase your skills and your competencies. Let's talk about adjustments in recruitment then. And I wanted to give you some examples of the sorts of adjustments that you can ask for if you have a mental health condition that may be helpful to you. And this is not an exhaustive list, it's just some examples to give you a sense of the sorts of things you can ask for. It might be that a long assessment day or a series of interviews, or even a long interview, it might be really helpful for you to have a rest break. It might also be helpful to have a rest break if you're doing a series of tests. These days there are a lot of online psychometric testing that goes on as the first gate post you have to go through. So if you need rest breaks, that's okay. If you need extra time in order to be able to complete exercises or an assessment day or an interview, that's okay too. Things like having your camera turned off might be helpful, particularly for remote interviews or remote assessments, or having it turned off for part of the time if that feels too self-exposing to have it on at all times. That's an adjustment that can be asked for. And then things like your body language, your tone, if you like. So what we don't want is for your interviewer to somehow assume that you're not motivated or that you're not interested because of your body language or tone of voice, that you're not motivated somehow for that particular role. So an adjustment we can ask for is to ensure that, for example, if your tone of voice sounds flat or if you're not making good eye contact, that doesn't go against you. So here the adjustment we ask the interviewer to make is one of changing their own attitude, to focus more on the content of what you're saying as opposed to the manner in which you're delivering it, so that does not go against you. And then having things in an alternative format. It might be that you prefer face-to-face as opposed to remote, and maybe these days as COVID becomes more the normality, if you like, perhaps we can go into actual meetings or interviews as opposed to remotely, or vice versa. It might be that you prefer a telephone interview rather than one with your camera on. It might be that you prefer a remote interview rather than a face-to-face one. Whatever that looks like for you, or any other alternative format that may be helpful for you, can be arranged and would be a reasonable request to make from an employer. And finally, rescheduling. So, it might be that you've really prepared for an interview, for an assessment day. You're very excited about it. You've done loads of work for that and you're ready to go. But then, a few days before or maybe even on the day, you feel unable to actually go ahead with that, maybe because of your mental health and the impact of that. And if that's the case, then actually rescheduling, asking for that to be rescheduled, is also an adjustment you can ask for, and for that not to be held against you. Now, caveat here is obviously if it's the very last assessment day for an employer, then they wouldn't be able to reschedule it, but as much as they can, then it's reasonable for you to ask them to do that, and they should be able to do that without that going against you in any way whatsoever. Any questions at all in the chat, Cindy?
No, there's nothing yet, Tab.
Thank you. Let's have a look then at some adjustments in the workplace. Whilst I know if all of you are still students, you're going to be going through a recruitment process first, but some of you may already be worrying about, well, what happens, let's say I get through the recruitment process, what happens once I'm in the workplace? What sorts of adjustments can I have there? Well, some of these may be similar to some of those things we've discussed about the recruitment process, but some may also be different. So things like having understanding from colleagues, making sure that your mental health condition doesn't go against you in terms of promotion or recognition within the organisation, making sure there's no disciplinary action that's taken for you if you have to have a certain amount of time off, or for any behaviours that may be a result of your mental health condition. And things like even adapting or changing the role are adjustments that can happen in the workplace. Once you get made a job offer, that will be the time to have detailed discussions with us about what sorts of workplace adjustments may be helpful. And once you do decide what these are, we'll work with you to figure out what might be best for you. It doesn't mean they can't change. They're not set in stone. So it might be you start off with some adjustments, but then as you're in the workplace for a bit longer, you realise, actually, well, no, that's not working as well. In fact, I need something different, or maybe I need something additional, and that's okay too. So once you get the job offer, that's the time to be thinking about workplace adjustments. You don't need to talk about workplace adjustments whilst you're going through the recruitment process, and employers can't lawfully ask you about workplace adjustments before they make you a job offer. So I think the thing to focus on here whilst you're going through a recruitment process is, what adjustments do you need for recruitment? And then once you get made a job offer, that's then the time to be having think about what sorts of adjustments might be helpful for you at that particular employer in that particular workplace. We also recognise that, of course, mental health conditions can be aggravated by stressful situations, and of course going through an interview, going through an assessment process can be can be very stressful situations. So again, I wanted to reiterate to you here that we are here to support you. One, to discuss what adjustments might be most helpful, because these may be different adjustments to those you received at university in education, because you're going through a different process. You're being asked to engage in different tasks and activities. But also, if you'd like us to, we can advocate that on your behalf to an employer that you are applying to, so that you don't have to worry about that aspect of it. You can ensure that you can turn up and do the best that you can with the right adjustments in place. I'm going to go through a series of misconceptions now. So misconception number one that we often hear from students that we are supporting is, to get the adjustments that I need, I have to talk about my condition. The simple answer to that is you don't actually. You don't need to tell the employer what your condition is in order to get adjustments. And under Section 60 of the Equality Act, during the recruitment process, employers cannot lawfully be asking you for details of what your disability is or any details of that disability. All they can lawfully ask you for is, what adjustments do you need? Therefore, to get any adjustments, you don't have to state what your condition is or any details of your condition. Of course, the minute you ask for adjustments, the employer will know that you have some condition, some disability, something, but they don't need to know what unless you wish to tell them that. So what's really important though is to focus on adjustments. Tell them about the adjustments that you need, because that's what's going to be helpful to you. And under Section 60, during the recruitment process, employers can't lawfully ask you what your disability is or any evidence of your disability. And that includes things like educational psychologist reports or medical evidence. Sometimes employers do ask you for these because they're not aware of Section 60 rules. However, if you want to support you and if you're not comfortable to tell them that information about you, personal sensitive information, we can work with you to make sure that you can frame that appropriately to the employer to get the adjustments you need, instead of sharing information you may not be comfortable to share, or we can share the adjustment information with them, again, without sharing any information about your disability or what it is. Misconception number 2, and I've already talked a bit about this, but I need to disclose my mental health condition so that the employer will know what I need. There is absolutely no reason to suppose that an employer is going to know what you need. They're not experts in your condition, and they're certainly not experts in how your condition impacts you. So you need to tell them what you need. You need to tell them what adjustments you need. And again, we can help with this and we can provide the advocacy around it. I need to disclose medical records or reports to prove that I have a condition. You don't. Again, to reiterate, employers are not entitled to ask you for proof of disability or any disability-related information in order to provide adjustments. Employers have a duty to provide adjustments during the recruitment process, but they're prohibited from asking you for any evidence or questions around your disability. Therefore, they can't ask you for things like educational psychologist reports, which often contains a lot of information about you and your disability, relevant for purposes of education perhaps, but not for purposes of recruitment. And in any case, it's too much information on there other than just your adjustment information. And thirdly, that adjustment information is for education, not for recruitment, so it may not even be relevant information. Once you've been offered a role, at that point, employers can indeed ask you further details about disability in order to ensure that they can put absolutely all the right adjustments in place for the workplace. You still don't have to tell them if you don't want to, that's entirely up to you. But at this point, once you get made a job offer, if you don't give them the information they need, they may not be able to put the appropriate workplace adjustments in place for you. So there's a distinction between the recruitment process and once you've been made the job offer.
Tab, we have a question here. I don't have the full, I've asked for some background information. I don't have all the answers yet, but I think this might be an interesting point to talk about it. So somebody here has anxiety issues and was told by a member of their family who is a doctor not to report it or take any medication, since that would go onto their health record, which might later be problematic in their career. Obviously, I asked which career they were looking at, and it would be in construction as a structural engineer. But this person has now answered that there's no suggestion necessarily that they'd be working with dangerous machinery or anything like that. So that's your context.
Okay, look, so what I would say to you is that if you have a mental health condition, if you have anxiety or whatever your mental health condition looks like, or any condition actually, that affords you protection under the Equality Act, I'd say the first thing you have to figure out is what adjustments do you need. Secondly, employers or nobody else has any access to your medical records unless you provide them access to it, unless you consent to access to it. employers don't automatically get access to your medical records. That would be breaking GDPR and privacy rules. So I don't think that seeking medical advice or support or medication, whatever that looks like for you, therapy, that you should be put off doing that because you're worried about an employer having access to that information. They can only have access to your private, personal, sensitive information if you provide them access to it. As I've been saying, in order to get adjustments, nonetheless, you may need adjustments in a recruitment process. And I think it's really important that if you do need adjustments in the recruitment process, that you ask for those adjustments. Remember that in order to get those adjustments, you do not need to disclose any medical information during the recruitment process. So you can safely ask for the adjustments that you need without saying what your condition is, or even if that it is a mental health condition. You don't even have to mention that. Simply the adjustments that you need. I think if you need adjustments, it's really important you ask for them, because without them, you're perhaps not giving yourself a fair chance to be able to get through that process and compete effectively with other people either who don't need adjustments or with others who do need them and have asked for them. So I hope that answers that question. Any other questions in the chat, Cindy?
Yeah. So would the interview panel be aware of the adjustments in all cases?
So when we talk to employers for the adjustments that you need, we share it on a need-to-know basis. If anybody interviewing you, whether that's an individual or a panel of people interviewing you, need to make the adjustment for you, in other words, they need to implement that adjustment. Let's say that might be extra time, or that might be not to judge you negatively for tone of voice or lack of eye contact, for example, or whatever that looks like. If they're the ones who have to put the adjustment in place, or if that's extra time, then they would need to know the adjustment that they have to make, of course, in order to make it. But we would not share any information with them if they didn't need to know. So, for example, during a recruitment process, there might be certain information that just the person doing initial sifting and selecting needs to know. Maybe you took longer to complete your degree. Maybe you didn't get the grades you were expecting because of your mental health condition, but then you can prove that you have the right skill set or the right grades once adjustments are put in place. Whatever that looks like, if there's an adjustment of attitude that needs to be made for the selection part, then that would only be shared with the people who are doing the initial sifting and selecting. That would not be shared with the interviewers. But if you then get to, or let's say if there's a test for which you've had extra time, that's fine, that can be put into place with whoever needs to know to put that extra time in place for you, but that information does not need to be shared with interviewers. If you then get to the interview and there are specific adjustments that interviewers need to make, then of course that would need to be shared with the interviewers. So we share information with the individuals at each stage of the recruitment process on a need-to-know basis. I hope that answers that question. Anything else before I move on?
Yeah, we have. Would there ever be a need to share medical records with employers? I think this is a general question as opposed to specific types of jobs.
Only once you've been made a job offer, and again, which part of your medical record you wish to share or need to share in order to get the workplace adjustments you need can be very specific. You don't have to share your entire medical history. Once you get made the job offer, because remember, you don't need to share any of that during the recruitment process. You can get the adjustments without sharing any of that information during recruitment. Once you get made the job offer, an employer has a duty to ensure they put absolutely all the right adjustments in place for you for the workplace. The duty on them is much higher. So at this point, they have a duty to investigate further to ensure they can support you in the best way possible in the workplace. And for this, they may indeed ask for certain medical information from you. If you choose not to provide it, it is possible that they may not be able to provide you all the adjustments you need, but it is still within your choice about what information you wish to or don't wish to provide. Okay, so if there's no more questions, I'm going to move on to the next misconception.
We do have some more questions, but I think maybe we should push on for now and we can ask them a bit later. Yeah.
Okay, so the next one is, how do I know if the adjustment I'm asking for is reasonable? So you've probably heard this term. There's a term in the Equality Act called reasonable adjustments. If somebody can ask for reasonable adjustments, employers have to make them. I think it's quite a confusing term, because what's reasonable in law is actually different from what may be reasonable to me, to you, to a third person. And what's reasonable in law is based on the facts and circumstances, things like the size of the employer, the positive effect on you of having that adjustment, what resources are available to the employer, and so on. And so what I'd say to you is assume, if you need an adjustment, that it is reasonable, and don't worry too much about the reasonable aspect of that. If it isn't reasonable, it's for the employer to prove that it isn't reasonable. It's not for you to prove that it is. So, as I said, for example, the things taken into consideration, ultimately, whether or not something is reasonable is something for the tribunal to decide. And the sorts of things they take into account, things like effort and cost that have to be put in, would have to be disproportionate and burdensome in terms of resources of the organisation. So don't worry too much about that. Ask for what you need. You will generally get it. And if you're not comfortable or confident to do that, talk to us and we'll make sure that you get the adjustment that you need. And I can tell you that in 99.9% of cases, we are able to get the person the adjustment that they need to ensure that they can perform well, going through the recruitment process and in the workplace. It's better not to ask for adjustments to avoid discrimination. Misconception number 5. You must ask for the adjustment that you need. You have a much better chance of success with adjustments in place, and others who need them will be asking for them. So if you don't, you might be further disadvantaged. As with anything in life, there is always a risk, maybe in this case a risk of discrimination, but it is illegal to discriminate, and most reputable employers are not going to risk doing that. And further than that, I'd say, just taking it away from the law anyway for a bit, attitudes towards neurodivergence, mental health, disability are changing rapidly, and I'd say particularly for mental health. In these last few years, it was already very high on the agenda for employers, but particularly in these last few years during the pandemic, it has changed substantially, and employers are very mindful and concerned to make sure they're doing the right thing, to be putting the right accommodations in place, the right adjustments in place to ensure that their employees and people coming in the recruitment process have a fair chance through that. So I would say ask for what you need and don't worry about the discrimination aspect, because the chances are you will get what you need and therefore have a better chance of success. We've talked a lot about, with good reason, for why you don't have to worry about telling an employer about your mental health or what that mental health is, because we know that often people are really concerned about that, they're really worried about that, and understandably so. But there might be times when you want to tell an employer about your mental health condition. One, maybe because it's important to you. Maybe you just want to share that information. It's your information and you have a right to share it should you wish to. It might be that you want to use that to answer a competency question. For example, there might be a competency question about resilience, and maybe your mental health condition in dealing with that has taught you resilience. And if you're going to use that to answer a competency question, that's entirely up to you. Make sure you use the STAR technique, so situation, task, action, result, as you would with any competency question. And I'd say probably only use it for one competency. I wouldn't keep using that as the example, but certainly okay for you to use it for one of the competency questions if you wish to. It might be that you want to talk to them about your mental health because you want to assess their attitude towards it. Maybe it's really important to you to make sure that you're working for an inclusive employer. So again, that might be a reason why you might want to ask them certain questions or share certain information about yourself with them to see what their response is to that. It might be that you want to tell them because you are applying to a particular scheme or looking to get a particular qualification. So for example, under the government's Disability Confident programme, if employers have that symbol, or if an employer has a different symbol, Valuable 500 or one of our Next Generation Inclusive Employer symbols, then they might be running a specific programme or scheme where by telling them that you have a disability, even if it's not specifically that it's mental health, it might mean that you can participate in that particular programme or scheme, or sometimes bypass certain parts of the recruitment process. So I know, for example, for the civil service, if you have a disability and if you declare that you do, then you can bypass certain stages of the recruitment process. So it might be to your benefit, in other words, to let them know. It might be that you're applying to an employer for a specific role or particular type of organisation where it's to your benefit for them to know that you have lived experience of mental health or a disability. So again, really think about what your reasons might be. It might be to your benefit. Maybe you want to test their attitude. Maybe it's to answer a competency question. Maybe just simply that it's important to you. Ultimately, what you tell somebody, anybody, including an employer, particularly during the recruitment process, about your condition is about your privacy and therefore your choice. So it's entirely up to you what information you share, how much information you share. But remember, you don't have to share any information about your disability or any evidence for that in order to get the adjustments that you need. You define what you consider private, and the law is on your side, and you have protection under that to make sure you can get the adjustments even without telling the employer what your condition is during the recruitment process. I know that's different once you get made a job offer. At that point, they are entitled to ask you more information, but at that point you can then consider what information you're comfortable to share in order to get the workplace adjustments. Talked about this already, so an employer can ask you just to recap about your condition once you get made a job offer. You don't have to respond, but you may wish to in order to make sure you get the adjustments for the workplace, and an employer cannot lawfully withdraw an offer because of your condition, because that would be discriminatory. And finally, in terms of accessing our services, for those of you who may not yet be registered with us, you can register on our website, www.employ-ability.org.uk, and once you're registered, all services are available to you for free. And if you need any questions or anything in an alternative format, then you can contact us at that info@ address, or you can telephone that number there. And I'm now happy to take any other questions that anybody might have.
Okay, so what if you are diagnosed with a condition during employment? This is somebody who was diagnosed with ADHD after starting work. And just interestingly, that person also says that they aren't sure what they would need. So I've also pointed them in our direction. But I thought that might be an interesting one for you to also answer publicly.
Of course, look, if you're diagnosed with something once you're already in employment, you're still entitled to adjustments. Just because you didn't ask them at the beginning doesn't mean you're not entitled to them. And anything can happen, during our working lives, anything can happen. Something might change for us physically, mentally, in any other way. And, we might get a new diagnosis for something, condition we've already had, such as neurodivergence, but weren't aware of, or maybe some new condition that develops. For any of those reasons, or maybe you need a change in the adjustments. For any of those reasons, you can ask for adjustments at any point once you are employed, irrespective of whether you've asked them before or not. So once you get a new diagnosis, the important thing is to make sure that you understand what adjustments might be helpful to you. You can talk to the employer about that. You can share information that may be helpful for them to understand what adjustments to put into place for you. But if you're not sure, then do feel free to talk to us, and we'll be able to discuss with you what adjustments may be helpful and to support you and the employer to make sure those can be put into place for you. But also you can talk to the employer, and maybe you can figure out with them for the particular role that you're doing what sorts of adjustments may be helpful. But do talk to us if you aren't sure, because we might be able to make suggestions to you that you haven't sort of considered previously. Any other questions, Cindy?
Yeah. I'm just trying to work this. So this is one about university. Can we ask for adjustments at university as well? So it's an international student who isn't really aware of their rights around that.
Yes, you can ask for adjustments for education whilst you're at university. Universities are brilliant at making sure that they can provide adjustments in order that you can access that education properly. Now, that is dealt with typically through the disability office at university. However, the rules for asking for adjustments at university for education are different from those for employment, and universities can ask for proof and require evidence in order to provide you those adjustments. So we are specialists in employment and disability, but if you feel that you need adjustments for university, then speak to your disability office. They're very, very good at understanding what your needs might be in order for you to access education.
So somebody here is saying that they and their father and they have mental health conditions, and essentially this person's father has always said never to mention it, as they will be discriminated against in recruitment. And this person is asking whether we think that that's an accurate assessment of the situation, or whether it's slightly outdated. So essentially, to what extent is it realistic that somebody is going to discriminate if mental health conditions are mentioned during the recruitment process?
I'd say to you that, in my view and my opinion and EmployAbility's stance on this, is that we'd say that's possibly outdated view information, because not least because actually the law has changed. So pre-Equality Act 2010, employers were, under the old Disability Discrimination Act, allowed to ask you questions relating to your disability during the recruitment process, and they could ask you for details of that. That changed in 2010 under Section 60 of the Equality Act, where employers are prohibited from asking you any questions about your disability or details of disability. What that means is that you can ask for the adjustments you need without disclosing any information about your disability or mental health or whatever that is. And therefore, that reduces the chances of discrimination, because the employer doesn't actually know why you're asking for those adjustments. And lawfully, they're not entitled to ask you for that information. If they do, you can simply contact us and we will talk to you about how to deal with that, or we can talk to that employer on your behalf without disclosing that information, but ensuring you get the adjustments that you need. I think, again, it's really important that you get the adjustments that you need, because without that, you're not setting yourself up for success through the recruitment process.
Next question, is there a difference in what a candidate is entitled to if they're applying for work experience or internships if they're unpaid, as they may not technically be classed as future employees?
Cindy, do you want to take that one? As far as I'm aware, there isn't a difference. You're still entitled to adjustments, but I don't know if you have any more information on that from a legal perspective, Cindy.
Yeah, no, the first thing is that as a general rule, you are entitled to the minimum wage if you're working on a placement, if you're over 18. Obviously, there are some exceptions to that, which may be what you're talking about if you're getting that placement via your university and it's part of the study, it's part of your studying and it's kind of less than 1 year. However, there was a case, and so previously, before 2016, yes, there was a kind of grey area where you may not have been allowed entitled to adjustments. Since that case in 2016, it's been clarified that even if you're working in one of those exceptional situations where you're not paid, then you're still entitled to the adjustments. So the short answer is, irrespective of the situation, you are entitled to those adjustments.
Thank you.
So there's somebody here who has say they have a part-time job, but their uni courses are burdensome and they think they need to apply to take some leave during the exam times. I think leave is an assessment period, but the manager doesn't agree to give them that time off. I'm assuming the manager of their job. What I'm not sure about if that is related to a disability or whether that's just to do with their workload. But I suppose let's assume for the purposes of this that it's linked to a mental health condition.
Well, yeah. It's unclear from the question, but if you need the time off from your part-time job in order to be successful in exams, because you need to study for the exams, then the employer is not required to give you that time off if that doesn't work for them. And if you're working a job and you're doing certain hours, I think the employer has a right to expect you there for those hours and may or may not wish to give you study leave for you to pass your exams, because that's not really the employer's problem in a sense. If, however, you need time off because of a mental health condition, then that is something different, and employer would be required to give you time off if you have a mental health condition. So I think you'd have to be very clear about what purpose it is that you're asking for that time off for.
Thanks, Tab. If you don't yet have a diagnosis due to long waiting lists, can you still ask for adjustments? And if so, are there any that can't be provided that could if you were diagnosed?
So during the recruitment process, absolutely yes, you can ask for any adjustments that you need, irrespective of diagnosis, because you don't have to prove it. So during the recruitment process, you can ask for any adjustments that you need, the same as if you had a diagnosis or not. If you're impacted in a particular way, talk to us. We will discuss with you the ways in which you're impacted, what the best adjustments would be for you, and you can ask for those absolutely without a diagnosis. Once you get made a job offer, the employer will require a diagnosis in order to further understand the details of what adjustments you might need. So at that point, I suspect you probably would need then to have a diagnosis to get adjustments, but not necessarily. So it depends what sorts of adjustments you need and the employer working with and what relationship you build with them in terms of getting those adjustments, but they may need a diagnosis at that point once you get made the job offer, but not during the recruitment process.
Yeah, and I mean, I suppose because there's lots of case law around this actually, and they can require the diagnosis, but not if it essentially means that you're sitting there for a long period of time without adjustments. So I think what a tribunal would expect is for them to put something in place temporarily based on what occupational health says. I mean, I think that they would be in quite a tricky situation if they refuse to give you the adjustments you need. And of course, they would also be in a situation where they could pay for you to be privately diagnosed should it be holding things up too much. But that again would depend on their resources and how large an employer they were. But I think they would be expected nevertheless to put something in place for you.
In the interim, before the diagnosis, absolutely, yeah.
Somebody else saying they can't access adjustments at uni unless they have a proof of a diagnosis, which is true. That's a slightly different situation. Yeah. Let's see. Okay. In university, I obtained admission using contextual admissions offer that takes into consideration a number of things, such as disability, economic background, and mental health. Is there an equivalent to that in employment?
It depends is the answer. It depends on the employer. There are some employers who run specific programs, specific schemes for disability, for people from either ethnic minority backgrounds or for people from different backgrounds. It really depends upon the employer and what specific programs they might be running. I would say as a general thing, it doesn't necessarily apply, but they may be running a specific program or a specific scheme. As far as disability is concerned, sometimes there are employers who run specific disability programs, sometimes specific ones for neurodivergence or general disability programs. And sometimes these are the same programs as any internship. So for example, when we are working with employers, the route to an internship or a graduate program may be different in that you're applying through us, so we can support you in that process. And you may be able to bypass certain parts of their recruitment process, but you're ending up with the same job and you're essentially going through the same process as any other applicant. So this isn't about lowering the bar. This is about making sure that you get the right adjustments to perform to your best ability. And employers do recognise that. But sometimes, yes, there are specific schemes. Sometimes you can apply to for social mobility or ethnicity or disability.
Thanks, Tab. So next question, is there any way to prove or question the outcome of an interview if you feel you may have been discriminated against?
I'm going to give a short answer, Cindy. I'm going to hand over to you. It's quite tricky, I'd say, is the answer to that. Can be very difficult to prove discrimination during a recruitment process. I suppose, if you asked for specific adjustments and they simply didn't put those in place at all, and then therefore you didn't perform as well, I guess, you could say, well, you didn't put the adjustments in place, so I couldn't have performed to my best ability. Outside of that, I think it can be quite difficult to prove, but over to you, Cindy.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, it's extremely tricky. I mean, practically, I would say ask for feedback as to why you weren't successful. And in the event that you're given something meaningful and that references something that is linked to your disability, then in a sense, you have your proof there. To have a claim during the recruitment process that is linked to adjustments, you basically have to show that you were not given the job as a result of something linked to your disability, or a failure amongst that, within that is a failure to provide you with adjustments. That has to be the reason. So if you ask for feedback, or you're not given your adjustments, and that amounts to that, then in theory you have a claim. In practice, what we always say is, think very carefully. It's very time consuming to be bringing these claims. It can be expensive, and realistically, there are lots and lots of employers who'll be very, there's a war for disabled talent. There are many open-minded employers who will wish you to work for them, and you may want to just think, do I really want to work for somebody who's kind of discriminating against me in that way? It's not fantastic, the answer, but it's somewhat is what it is. It's just a lot easier to kind of get some kind of form of compensation, or get what you need once you have a job. Recruitment is somewhat tricky, but it is still there as an option.
I think also, I suppose you want to mitigate it getting to that point. So, and the way to do that is to make sure that you ask for and understand the process sufficiently. Ask questions about the recruitment process. What exercises, what tasks are you going to be asked to engage in, so that you can understand what adjustments you need because of the impact of your disability. And you might not be aware of the full sorts of adjustments that can be offered to you. And this is really where our student support team comes into their own. They're really experienced at talking to students about what adjustments might be helpful during different recruitment processes. They're not only familiar with disability adjustments, but also different processes that you might be able to having to engage in. So absolutely do talk to them, and they'll be able to, if you aren't sure about what adjustments may be helpful, they can make recommendations of those. So I think what's really important is you have the right adjustment in place for different parts of the process, and that is going to mitigate that risk of you maybe not being able to perform to your best ability because of the impact of your disability.
Mm-hmm. Very true. Another question: do you have to explain gaps in employment or education, or having left a job early because of a mental health condition? And how would you deal with questions around that in an interview situation? This person is saying that they're concerned that an employer would think that they would also leave their employment early, or have lots of time off, and as a result not employ them despite the fact that they're fully qualified for the role.
So I suppose what I'd say to that is that there are different types of adjustments, and one type of adjustment, the EmployAbility, we call it attitudinal adjustment, or an adjustment of perception, is one that we might ask the employer to make. If you have a CV where you have gaps on your CV, either because of having left a job early, or taking longer to complete a degree, or whatever, or maybe having gaps in your education, whatever that looks like for you, then I think it's really important that when you submit your application, that you do to some extent explain those gaps. And essentially what you're doing is asking them to make the adjustment and not hold that against you, because the gaps are there as a result of an impact of your disability. Looking at it the other way, if you don't explain those gaps, then it's up to them how they interpret those gaps. And that might be the end of your application anyway, because there's gaps, they don't understand them, they've got thousands of applications, and there's too many questions around the gaps in your CV, you haven't explained anything about it. So that may be the end of your application anyway. Alternatively, you tell them, I had to take a break here because of my mental health condition. I've then sought treatment for that, or I've got medication for that, or I've had therapy for that, or whatever that looks like for you. And now that means that I'm not impacted in that way. So I think letting them know why the gaps are there, what you've done to address those, what you're doing to support yourself with those, might be helpful information. And then the adjustment you're really asking for that is for them not to hold that against you.
Yeah, and I suppose it's the point you made earlier as well. You can say that without actually mentioning that it's a mental health condition as well. You can say due to my disability and leave it at that. The other piece here is that if we're referring, I know that the person who asked this question was talking about gaps specifically in leaving jobs early, but just to be clear, time off So they're not allowed, potential employer is not allowed to ask you any questions about your attendance at previous employment. That falls within the Section 60 prohibition. So they shouldn't be saying, oh, did you have much time off? How many days off did you? And we have actually seen this when we've been, with employers, and they do ask questions like that because they don't realise that falls foul of the Equality Act. But they're not allowed to ask you anything about attendance. Or ask you to explain anything around that, actually.
I suppose even if they don't ask you, I guess my understanding from what this person was asking was, I suppose your CV may show it anyway, that you were with an employer from such date to such date and then weren't employed for a period of time, and then the next time you were employed. I suppose your CV may demonstrate that.
I think that's right. No, but that's what I meant, is like this person was asking about gaps, but I thought it was just important to also kind of tie in here the fact that if we're talking about absences, that's something slightly different. And they're not allowed to ask questions around that.
Absolutely.
When should we sign up for the employability services? I am currently a penultimate year student.
Now is a very short answer to that. If you haven't signed up to employability, do it now. Do it as soon as possible. Do it after this session. Sign up as soon as possible. The other thing I should mention here is when you do sign up, and as soon as you sign up, all of our services are open to you for free. But when you do sign up, we won't automatically reach out to you because we get hundreds and thousands of people registering with us a day. So you have to be proactive. Once you sign up, if you have a specific question, if you need a particular sort of support, you need to actively reach out either by email or phone to our student support team, who will then be able to work with you and advise you accordingly.
Another question, is there, in our opinion, a specific length of time or number of days that would be considered excessive? I'm assuming this means taken off, to take off as a result of a condition. During my placement year, I found taking long weekends and every 4 to 6 weeks, long weekends every 4 to 6 weeks helpful, and a week off about every 3 months, but I was worried that was taking too much time off. So I'm assuming as an adjustment we're talking about here.
Look, I think you have to figure out what works for you, agree that with your employer. We're talking about once you're in the workplace here, it sounds like. I think you have to figure out what's helpful to you and agree that with your employer. As far as I know, and Cindy, correct me if I'm wrong, there isn't necessarily any specifics around this, although employers do sometimes have a certain number of sick days that they have available. Now, that's different from time off because of disability, as far as I'm aware. But again, I think this may vary from employer to employer and what their particular rules are as well.
Yeah, certain employers have disability leave, but that's not mandatory. They choose that as a policy. And but even without disability leave, if that's the adjustment that a doctor says you need, then that's the adjustment that you should be given. As long as it's reasonable, as long as that amount of time off is something that employer can reasonably afford. So, but again, you ask for what you need, and and if that's what you need, then that's what you should ask for. When or if an organisation asks a previous employer for a reference, does the previous employer give numbers of absence days as part of the reference?
No, is the short answer to that. And typically these days, majority of previous employers will simply state the date from which you started and the date you left, and they won't say anything else about you or any other detail of that, and that's typically to protect themselves legally. So typically all they'll state is that yes, you're an employee from this date to this date.
I don't think we have any more questions. I think we've covered everything.
Okay.
No, something is coming up. Do you know if it tends to be harder to get these sorts of adjustments if working in the third sector, i.e. because their budgets are tight? Charity sector, I assume, yeah?
Look, ultimately, when we're talking about recruitment adjustments, these aren't going to be super expensive adjustments. These aren't going to be necessarily difficult adjustments to make, typically. In which case, I don't see why you won't be able to get these adjustments, whichever organisation you're applying for. If you're talking about the not-for-profit sector as an employer, there may be things that come into it in terms of the adjustments that can be made for you depending on the size and the resources of the organisation. I'll give you an example. We're a not-for-profit, but outside of that, whether you're a not-for-profit or whether you're a for-profit organisation, being irrelevant, it's the size of the organisation. If we're a relatively small organisation, and therefore the expectations on us to make certain types of adjustments may be different, likely will be different from those for a large multinational organisation or a much bigger organisation. So what an adjustment an employer can be asked to make can be to change you to a different post or place of work. Now, we're a relatively small organisation, that would be almost impossible for us to do because we wouldn't necessarily have a different post that you could go to. But if you're working for an organisation with, sort of 60, 70, 80, 100 plus members of staff, then that's probably more likely to be possible for them. So it depends on the facts and circumstances, is what I would say. And in the workplace, it will very much depend upon what resources the employer has, what practical availability the employer has to give you the adjustments that you need, based on their resources and their size and so on.
And I think that's everything for now. If anybody else has any questions, it's now or never. No, nothing else coming up.
Thank you. Well, look, if there's nothing else coming up, then our contact details are here. We've got the info address that you can email once you've registered, and our website address there where you can go ahead and register. Please do register if you haven't already done so. Once you have registered, you can then reach out to that telephone number or that email address there to our student support team, who will be able to work with you on an individualised basis, your particular case, to advise you and support you with adjustments and what they can do to support you to get that job that you deserve. Thank you very much for listening to me this afternoon. And I know this session is being recorded, so this will also be available as a resource through your career service, and enjoy the rest of your day. Many thanks for the great questions.